Thank you for deferring as well. I appreciate getting me up to the front. You didn't have to do that. Thank you. Listen, this is an important issue to me. In a span of about 10 days, back in February, we had both a shooting in the ER of our West Palm Beach VA Medical Center and a suicide. This is something that I believe at the same hearing you were speaking about before, a budget hearing, spoke to Secretary Wilkie about this issue. And he said, to quote him, as a result of what happened at Palm Beach, we have a new security protocol in place that will apply to the entire country. We have undergone we've already done it. We've undergone a complete review of our security protocols. Not we're going to undertake this. We've undergone a complete review of our security protocols. What happened at Palm Beach with the wounding of 3 medical professionals has led us to revamp the entire way we do security, because I will tell you that the method that was used there was entirely unexpected. I find it hard to believe that somebody pulling a firearm out of a scooter is entirely creative attack. It's not that creative. I am worried that that is unexpected when we look at how we assess threat. But in that, I would like you to tell us, Ms. Oshinsky, what has been revamped for the entire country in the way that we do security.
Anytime there is a serious event at any one of our medical centers, we look in depth at what occurred and try to make improvements, because the last thing any of us want is to repeat a mistake that leads to another serious incident. So in this case, I think there are a number of things that occurred. One thing is we are asking at all sites that when people come to the emergency department in a wheelchair or some other of their own a vehicle, they be put in a wheelchair that is owned by the medical center. So that is one way. It's very difficult, I think, when you have somebody who is handicapped. We need to make sure that they're in our owned equipment. So that is one thing that happened.
So to pause, you're saying that now at West Palm Beach VA, if you showed up in a scooter or your own wheelchair, you're going to be transferred into a VA-owned wheelchair.
Correct.
Is that occurring as we speak?
That's what the police are telling me, yes.
Interesting. Please continue.
Yes. Another thing that is, again, at West Palm Beach, sometimes we find that there are concerns that we missed in the vulnerability assessment. So, for example, we are undergoing a construction project at West Palm Beach because we need to make sure that we have adequate coverage by cameras. And that is happening. Another thing, we're also doing more extensive rounding in our parking lots. West Palm Beach is not the only place where that needed to happen. We need to reiterate with everyone that part of our responsibility is making sure that the parking facilities where veterans are coming in are patrolled. So another part of what we're doing as a result of what happened at West Palm Beach.
So let me pause on the patrol there. In the same week, I went to both the West Palm Beach VA and the Orlando VA. You drive to the Orlando VA, they are checking for IDs prior to driving on the campus, albeit I only had to hold any ID up in my window. I didn't have to actually roll down my window. Nobody read it. Nobody looked at it. I could have been anybody, but they did at least ask that I hold an ID up in my window. I think there's some hole in there. West Palm Beach VA, you drive directly onto the campus. Obviously, just between 2 VAs, there's a little bit of a disconnect between that, what's going on with security. They say you've seen one VA, you've seen one VA, and there's a lot of truth in that. So to ask a couple specific questions on my local VA, West Palm Beach. One, will there be checking of IDs as people enter the campus? And 2, are people's IDs supposed to be checked as they actually enter the hospital? And I ask this because I'm constantly getting photos and reports from my veterans going in and out of the VA, often saying, there's nobody at the front door, there's nobody checking IDs, or sometimes there are. What is the standard of what is actually supposed to occur there, and is it being enforced? And when you talk about needing more agents to go out there to conduct inspections, what about the VA director that's actually in charge of the facility being responsible for their facility?
On a variety of fronts, yes, we should be checking an ID, and I am told that that is now happening at West Palm Beach. So I will verify that and get back to you to make sure that that's happening.
Your
whether
standard
it's
is somebody enters the hospital, their ID should be checked.
That's what I'm going to verify.
Thank you.
Yes. but that is my understanding of one of the things that was to occur as a result of the incident. And completely agree with you. One of the reasons we want to do this review of what should be adequate staffing based on risks, one of the areas that we're continuing to look at, and I think recognizing with what we had heard from GAO and the OIG, that our vulnerability assessments need to be improved at our sites. We will be in the process of doing that, and obviously one of the things that we will consider as we moving West Palm Beach High into that, that implementation period.
Step back on something that Mr. Moulton was speaking about. I wanted to get to it earlier, but I want to make sure I have the numbers correct in what you were saying. There are currently 4,000 filled VA police force positions and 700 vacancies. Am I understanding that correctly? So the total full up would be 4,700 roughly?
Roughly, yes.
So at 4,000 by 139 facilities, we're talking about roughly 28 officers per facility. Would that be a rough average, or would you see these dispersed in a little bit different way?
Well, the number of individuals at the site obviously is going to be based on the size of the numbers of people who are there, the size of the campuses, and as we talked about, security vulnerabilities that may exist at some places or not exist at others.
Could you give me an example of one of the larger facilities that has, say, the most officers versus one of the smaller facilities that has a more minimal number of officers of that 139?
You would be looking at places that perhaps have multiple campuses, of Palo Alto, California.
How many officers might they have?
I would have to look at what that might be.
Okay. So on average, so if we move that up to 4,700, we'd be looking at what we could place 33 per facility if we did that. Is it that there are not enough officers? Is that not enough? Mr. Moulton, he did reference the fact that in some of his cities, that's more officers that are in law enforcement for an entire city on a VA campus, on a single VA campus, maybe multiple campuses, but that's quite a few officers.
So one of the things that we are doing is trying to develop that staffing model to address these very items. There may be things with vulnerabilities where we need more. There may be places where we need less. So we are doing a staffing assessment. We're going to be using, I think we had talked about the data that had been put together by Homeland Security and assessing those. That will be considered, and we hope to have those staffing models completed by September 30th.
Thank you. And to go back to something that you referenced, I want to make sure that I understand this correctly. You said in response to the shooting in West Palm Beach, VA, that individuals coming into the hospital in a wheelchair would be, or a scooter, some sort of mobility platform, would be removed from their mobility platform, moved into a hospital mobility platform, wheelchair, something to that effect, whatever it may be. Do you mean anybody and everybody coming into the facility, or just those going into the ER?
Just those going into the emergency department.
What do you see is the difference in terms of threat assessment between somebody going into the ER versus somebody coming in a mobility platform and anywhere else? Not that I by any means think this is the most well thought through approach to doing this, but in the threat assessment, what is the difference?
And I would have to look into that in more detail, so I would have to get back to you. I do think that some of the issue, honestly, you know, when we talk about staffing levels, is then having people be able to transport folks. So I think we're looking at probably a staging as we do that. I know often when you go to a community hospital, you are put in their chairs when you go there. So I think that really is probably what's happening in the community as well.
I've done threat assessment very specifically as my work prior to a member of Congress on a number of different fronts with different agencies. And I see absolutely no difference in terms of the threat of whether somebody is going into the ER for perhaps some sort of trauma. If we're talking about some instance of being institutionalized for mental health counseling, that might be different, but I see no difference in the threat of somebody coming into the ER versus another part of the facility in terms of what they could bring in that would pose a threat to people within the hospital or patients within the hospital, anybody else. So what I would like to ask of you is, would you please be willing to give me a brief, come into my office, give me a brief on everything that has been put into place, since we're not going to be able to cover all of this?
certainly.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.